there's Lee. Hi, Lee McIntyre. Can you hear us?
I can. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay.
We can hear you.
And we can see you excellently. Herman and me are going to interview you, and I'm going to start with a short introduction, Lee. We welcome Dr. Lee McIntyre as our next speaker. Lee McIntyre will join us from Boston in the United States for the next 45 minutes. Lee has written many scientific books and a novel which received excellent reviews. He has held numerous positions in the scientific community. Lee McIntyre is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University. Among the alumni of Boston University are well-known names, for instance, Faye Dunaway, Tipper Gore, and we can mention the name of the notorious Howard Stern.
So on his website, Lee McIntyre states that science, and I quote, "Science, facts, truth and evidence are under attack. Philosophers have been concerned with these topics for years." I'm a philosopher, so I feel addressed. But where are they now that the world needs them? And this is what Gert-Jan and I will talk about with Lee. And of course, we'll discuss his latest book, titled How to Talk to a Science Denier, Conversations with Flat Earthers, Climate Deniers and Others Who Defy Reason.
Well, Lee, how are you doing? And very good to have you here. Thank you for taking time for our conference. Can you identify with this introduction?
It's a very nice introduction. Thanks so much.
So Lee, Gert-Jan and I prepared this interview together with you, and we plan to discuss at least 3 topics. The first one is what is science and what is science denial? The second one is science denial a personal position or a personal affair, or is science denial a group thing or a group process? How do science deniers find, like-minded people to maybe start a movement? God forbid. Is there an intentional process of organization in science denial? And if so, who's actually organizing it? So that's the second topic. And the third topic, what can we expect? What will happen now that science believers and science deniers seem to clash? Are we at a tipping point? These are the 3 kind of topics that we want to discuss.
But perhaps we should start with this question. Why does this topic appear on a skeptic conference? Herman and I remember well when skeptic conferences were about things like UFOs, eternal consciousness, crop circles and other things that many people consider to be rather far from their thinking. These days, skepticism seems to be much more relevant. At a family party or in your where you work, you might easily run into ferocious conversations about whether the coronavirus exists at all. In a nutshell, those interested in rational thinking and science are now suddenly at the center of attention, in the Netherlands that is. How is the situation in the United States?
Well, I'm afraid that some of the crop circle and UFO folks gained ground, and now they're coming for vaccines and other things. That's the trouble. That type of reasoning has gotten worse in the United States in the last decade or so, I think.
And do you see the same polarization? And do you see the same getting these subjects into the workplace and family dinners?
Tell us about the last Thanksgiving dinner.
It's hard because some of these views now that we 10 or 20 years ago would have thought that, how could these be views that are widely held? They've now gone fairly mainstream. I mean, a shocking percentage of the American public believe that there are microchips in the coronavirus vaccines. I think that's as strange a view as the idea that there are UFOs or aliens or crop circles, as you mentioned. But now, rather than reading about that and wondering, I don't think I know anyone like that, now you hear about the microchips in the vaccines or things like that across the Thanksgiving table from your uncle. And then you need to have a conversation. And that's the problem. What do you say in that conversation? Because if you merely share facts, It's not going to work.
And why is it not going to work if you merely exchange facts or talk about the facts?
Well, I'll give you I think this is a true answer, and I don't mean it to sound glib, but it is true. If somebody's beliefs aren't based in facts, they can't be overturned by facts. Jonathan Swift said it better than that. He said, you can't reason somebody out of something they didn't reason themselves into in the first place. So I think that when people hold those sorts of beliefs, it's not because they have evidence for them. It's because they are conspiracy theory minded, and maybe they would count it as evidence, but it's not really, that they've heard rumors, or they've seen something on their favorite news program that makes them suspicious. The built-in cognitive biases in the human brain just make us ripe for this sort of thing, so that when disinformation comes through, a certain percentage of people will start to believe it. And notice I said disinformation, not misinformation. I think that science denial is not a mistake, it's a lie. Somebody's interests are at stake. It's not just a mistaken belief, it's one that somebody wants us to believe.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there in your first answer to such a substantial question. Maybe we should take a couple of steps back. I guess most people here today at this Congress believe in science, and you define science as follows. You say the hallmark of science is how it responds to evidence. Scientists care about evidence and are willing to change their minds based on new evidence. Science cannot offer proof, but rests on the idea that belief is justified when sufficient credible evidence is present and sufficient rigorous testing has been done. Right. I take it that you also mentioned this because you want to make that difference between scientific claims and other, let's call them knowledge claims. How does that work out?
Well, I like you, I think that science is a wonderful thing. And the reason science is wonderful is because it provides a check on what we want to believe. We might, through our instinct or our intuition, think that some particular thing is true, but we really don't know whether it's true until we've tested it, until we've tested our hypothesis in the world. That's why, another distinctive thing about science, and really this is Carl Sagan's idea, is that they're both open-minded and skeptical, right? You have to be open to new evidence because it might change your mind. But you have to be skeptical of a new theory until there is sufficient evidence to believe it. I just, since I was a kid, I've thought that's a wonderful way to reason. And I'm shocked at how that standard has eroded during my lifetime.
So maybe we can address a specific example just to illustrate what you mean. Gert-Jan.
Yes, you have done a lot of field research on science denial, and what I found very interesting is your vivid and colorful description of your visit to a flat Earth conference in your latest book. Yeah. Let's start by noting these people, these flat earthers, are really convinced that the Earth is flat. I always thought in the beginning that it was a kind of ironic point of view, but there's nothing ironic about it. These people are dead serious. In my view, the main characteristic of science denial by the flat earthers is that they do not do anything with evidence. They are not willing to change their minds at all in the face of new evidence. As one of the flat earthers said, you quote him in his book, it's not a belief, it's knowing. Can you clarify, based on the experience you gained at the Flat Earth conference, what the 5 characteristics of science denial are? You mentioned in your book.
Yeah. A flat earther, or most science deniers, will tell you that their beliefs are based on evidence. But the problem is this, they're distrustful people. So who are they really going to change their mind based on new evidence? If you present them with evidence that should change their mind, but they don't trust you, it's not going to work. And so the problem is not just their specific belief, it's the way that they reason. And you brought up the 5 characteristics, and this was earlier work done by the Hufnagel brothers and John Cook and Stephen Lewandowski. who really, made a great breakthrough here to find that all science deniers reason in the same flawed way. They cherry pick evidence. They believe in conspiracy theories. They rely on fake experts and they denigrate real experts. They're illogical, and they believe that science has to be perfect. This idea that unless science can offer you proof or certainty, then their view is nothing, and you don't have to believe it, and any view might be just as likely to be true. So, and here's the interesting part. Once you understand that flawed reasoning strategy, then that gives you an opening to push back, not just with facts, but with how they're thinking about the facts, how they're thinking about the evidence.
But what does it help? You describe in your book an interesting conversation you had with a flat earther, and you almost crowdfunded enough money to fly over the South Pole. Tell us a little bit about that. What happened?
This was a speaker who had just gotten done giving a seminar on how to recruit people into flat Earth. And when he came off stage, I asked him, "Can I take you to dinner? I'm a philosopher of science. I don't believe in flat Earth, but can we talk over dinner?" And we did, and we had a 2-hour dinner. And I asked him my very hardest question first, which is, what evidence? I think my dog just came in, pardon me. It was a ghost. What evidence, if I had it in my back pocket, could prove you wrong? And he was smart enough person, he was an intelligent person. And so he understood the stakes of not being able to answer this question, right? This was kind of the moment of truth, shall we say. And at first he said, well, I'd have to go up in a rocket and see for myself, look back to Earth and see if it was curved. But then he took that back and said, no, that wouldn't work because maybe somebody had put in curved windows. See, conspiracy theory. So then I said, well, what about if we flew over the South Pole? Because I just got out of a seminar in which I heard one of the speakers say that part of the evidence for flat Earth is that there were no flights over the South Pole. And he said, well, there aren't any. And out of my back pocket, I pulled the itinerary and said, shall we go? And he shook my hand and said yes. And then took it back and thought, well, maybe we let me put it this way, we both started to worry because I didn't want him to look out the window and say, oh, these windows are curved. So I remembered what I just heard in the seminar, which was that they think, and they're dead serious about this, you're exactly right, that not only is the Earth flat, but Antarctica is a mountain range that is spread out 24,000 miles around the perimeter of the Earth to keep the water from falling off. Well, that means that you couldn't fly over Antarctica. And I think Antarctica is 1,500 miles across. And so you could have a flight from Chile to New Zealand. But he didn't think that. He thought it was 24,000 miles. And so I said, why don't we, as a measurement of who's right, see whether we have to stop for fuel? Because, if you're right, we'll have to stop for fuel. If I'm right, we won't. And then he shook my hand again. And at that point, I thought, oh boy, you'd each give $10 to see this flight happen, wouldn't you? The flights were $800 a piece. This would be wonderful. He immediately took it back and said that he thought that maybe it was a hoax. And I asked him to clarify. And he said that perhaps no plane ever had to stop for fuel. At which point I said, you mean to tell me that the entire history of air travel since before we were born has been a fraud, a hoax, against the day when I might be here trying to convince you to take this flight with me and convince you that the Earth is round because I'm doing the work of the devil? And he said, right. That's right.
Right. So
the discussion stopped there.
So
it did not stop there. We had an hour and a half left.
so we're quite justified in concluding that these people are very distrustful, right?
Yes,
So,
and and also that their views are not actually based on evidence. I mean, look, if I had said to him, well, I guess your view isn't based on evidence, then it's based on faith, then the conversation probably would have been over. He would have been angry and walked away.
Right, okay.
But I could see by the look on his face, because he was an intelligent person, that even without me saying that, he understood. But that question, I didn't make up that question. Karl Popper made up that question. That's a very important question. What evidence could convince you that you were wrong? Any scientist can answer that.
Well,
science deniers cannot answer that.
Yeah, but let me try to play the devil's advocate here.
Okay, literally the devil's advocate, according to them.
Maybe these people simply look at the results of science or look at scientific research, and what they see, and of course that's their focus, but what they see is that science itself is not free of blemishes either. That is to say, research, for instance, in the social sciences is sometimes not replicable. Fraud in research is reported more frequently. Articles are retracted and economic predictions fail to materialize. You could say, does science not have a job to hold people's trust? Mm-hmm. And are they doing a good job? And might that not fuel these kinds of weird beliefs that even smart people have?
Remember trope 5 of the strategy, science has to be perfect. Because if there's even one blemish in science, then that justifies them in throwing the whole thing away and saying, I guess my views are just as good as yours because you can't prove yours either. So yes, there are flaws in science. I wrote an earlier book called The Scientific Attitude, in which I had a chapter on fraud and all those things that fall short of fraud but are still not good scientific reasoning. The interesting thing that I believe is that when scientific fraud is caught, when mistakes happen, when people get impatient with some of the ways short of fraud that scientists run experiments, who catches those mistakes? It's other scientists. Scientists are very attuned, very critical of one another's work. And science is not perfect, but it is, I think, the best form of reasoning for learning about the empirical world. So, when somebody says, well, science isn't perfect, therefore I'm justified in thinking that I saw an alien, come down from the sky when I was fishing with my brother and we were drinking that night. No, that's it. Because it's not about proof. It's about warrant. It's about evidence. It's about likelihood based on the evidence. And I think that in that, science wins.
Sure. And, I agree with you, but what if, in light of if someone says, look, but this, I'm not quite convinced. If science lies to me once, it could lie could lie always. And in light of what they call the crisis of science, maybe they simply say, look, I'll do my own research, right? And that's, I think, the magical phrase nowadays, I'll do my own research. And what they mean is, I'll Google and I'll watch YouTube, etc. Right. That's their own research. They don't want to be convinced by scientists. They don't want to be convinced exclusively by scientists. But they boost this idea that they are the critical thinkers. You're not the critical thinker. They are the critical thinkers.
They identify as skeptics.
Yeah, and how should we react to that?
They identify as skeptics. They do not identify as deniers. I've never met a denier. I've only met a skeptic. They like that word. But they don't understand what skepticism means. Science deniers are what I call cafeteria skeptics. They go through the line and they choose the things that they're going to be skeptical of, which are the things that conflict with their ideological beliefs, and they leave the others alone. And skepticism, look who I'm talking to, you all understand skepticism. But the thing that the science deniers don't understand is that skepticism doesn't just mean that you reject everything. It means that you're willing to say what the standard is for your belief. And you can have a fairly high standard, but you need to be able to say in advance. I mean, I define a science denier as somebody who not only goes against the scientific consensus, but who doesn't have evidence for their beliefs and won't say what evidence would convince them. That's very different from what a scientist does. And here it's, I mean, science deniers often have a double standard of belief. They require overwhelming evidence for the things that they don't want to believe in, but they're actually quite gullible about the things that they do want to believe in. And I think what this suggests, and this came to me as I was writing the book, they always paint science denial as being about doubt, but I don't think it's actually about doubt. I think it's about distrust. This goes back to what I was saying before. They are conditioned to distrust scientists. And that's a very dangerous thing, because what that means is if you doubt something, then presumably the evidence could convince you otherwise. But if you distrust the person giving you the evidence, then you won't believe anything that they say.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that undermines not just some particular belief about the shape of the earth, say, but it undermines all scientific belief. It undermines the basis for science. And so trust, I think, distrust, you said it yourself, distrust is really at the heart of science denial.
Which gives us a very good stepping stone for the second subject we want to discuss with you based in your book. Is science denial a group thing? When a person says it's not a belief, it's knowing, that does mean something. That means that they really invested in what they're saying and thinking. You know that some flat earthers pay a price for their beliefs. They are looked down upon at their workplace and in the family circle, and yet they stay with the club. How about that? Why do people stick to their so-called knowing, to the distrust you mentioned? Who are these people? Why have they lost their faith in the real experts in the first place?
Science denial is about identity. It's about community. Imagine a world in which you distrusted the people around you. You distrusted the scientists, the teachers, the government officials, people in authority, the elites who were telling you what was true. That would be a very disorienting thing. You would want somebody to trust, somebody who was on your team. So say you go off and you do your own research, which you're right. They're not actually doing research. They're going off on Google and looking at YouTube videos. Well, but those are full of disinformation. Those are full of lies. And so, again, not skeptics, not real skeptics. But all of a sudden, suppose you wondered whether the earth was flat, and then you found a video on YouTube which asked some questions that you couldn't answer, which suggested that maybe it was. And then because of the algorithm on YouTube, it gave you 20 more. You are radicalized at that point. You might think, wow, I found my tribe. I found the people who believe what I believe. And so it is, I mean, we've known since the 1950s that there's a social aspect to belief. People conform in their beliefs to, the folks around them. Those are the people that they trust, which means that if you're surrounding yourself with bad information and people who don't know any more than you do, you're going to have some pretty strange beliefs.
And referring to the title of your book, how are you going to talk to these people? Is there a meaningful conversation possible?
There is, and the important thing to remember, I like the way you put it, a meaningful conversation. If your goal is to convince them to give up their beliefs, you will likely fail. Not only because it's hard to do, but because they will pick that up and it will become adversarial and argumentative. And I, as a philosopher, understand that, philosophers go into a situation like this thinking, well, we should debunk them. Let's humiliate them. Not going to work. If you want to convince somebody to give up a closely held belief that's not based on evidence, not based on good evidence, you have to treat it as if it were an identitarian belief, which it really is. It would be like trying to talk somebody out of their religious beliefs or out of their political beliefs. So to do, and this is possible. To do this, you have to treat them with respect, not the belief, but the person. You have to listen. You have to remain calm. As much as possible, be curious. Ask them, why do you believe that? Well, what's your source for that? Well, why do you trust this person but not that person? What led you to distrust the scientific evidence on this? And what's the basis? So you can have quite interesting conversations. And by the way, I recommend that these be done face to face, because a magical thing happens when you talk to someone face to face. They begin to trust you more. Just by showing up at the Flat Earth Convention, I think that I overcame some of the skepticism that they had toward me. I didn't convince anyone, to give up their belief and leave the conference, but I did get them to listen. And I accomplished that by listening to them. And there are numerous anecdotal accounts in the literature, mostly in the popular press, about anti-vaxxers and climate deniers and other people who have given up their beliefs when they were engaged with somebody who approached them with respect.
Right. But were you at all surprised to see that there are these flat Earth conference classes where they are given instructions how to convince others of the fact that the Earth is flat?
It was fascinating to me. They had two of those. And this fellow that I took to dinner had just given one in which he was talking about how to give a street clinic, which is when he's standing there all alone on a street corner with a sign that says, "The Earth is flat, ask me how I know," or something like that. And I mean, he was an excellent debater. You'd have to be. The fascinating thing for me is that the advice he gave about how to get people into flat Earth was, don't confront them, don't be loud, don't be angry. Let them ask questions. Let them try to convince you, and they'll fail, and then you can try to convince them. Listen to what they have to say. Be respectful. He was giving the same advice. He was giving the same advice for how to get them into flat Earth as I was giving for how to get them out. And the thing is, this modality of talking to people works in street epistemology. It works in conversations with political extremists. It works in getting people out of cults. So, it's not something that I invented. It's something that's a thing out there in the world, and is used by people the world over. It's just that we're coming to it relatively late in realizing that this is also how we have to talk to science deniers, because for many years we've been convinced that they're just stupid, or that they just lack the information. And so we're condescending and we share the information. When they don't believe it, we walk away. That's not how to do it.
Right.
I think we can also, based on this, take a closer look at the aspect of organizing and group formation in science denial. It's not just that there are very many different anti-science beliefs with different forms of organizations. Examples abound: the anti-vax, microchips in vaccines, climate denial, anti-5G, anti-GMO, interestingly enough on the left side of the political spectrum, anti-evolution theory, and what are we forgetting? Not every group organizes exclusively around some anti-scientific belief. You also know that science denial is sometimes organized by business interests or political interests.
Yes.
I found a passage in the epilogue of your book telling you talk about the participants in the storming of the Capitol building, that they had a false idea of the reality. They were really convinced that the election had been stolen, and that's why they were there. And then you say the following, and I quote, "What happened on January 6, 2021 at the US Capitol began at the Plaza Hotel in 1953, where a handful of executives decided to fight the science by creating a disinformation campaign against the facts that hurt their business interests. They created a blueprint for future denial of any fact that did not fit someone's preferred reality." Can you explain that?
Yes, so those were the tobacco executives in 1953 who were reacting to forthcoming scientific study which was going to show a link between cigarette smoking and cancer. And they hired a public relations person to come in and advise them. And his advice was to fight the science, which they did. This was so successful that it created a blueprint for the next 60 years of science denial. It's the same blueprint that the ExxonMobil and the other fossil fuel companies followed when they wanted to fight the science on climate change. And it's easy for folks like us to look at that and think, well, that's absurd. How could anybody believe that? But it was wildly successful because remember that all they had to do, they didn't have to prove that cigarette smoking didn't cause cancer. All they had to do was show that there was doubt about it and delay while they sold cigarettes. Now, sometimes science denial is motivated by economic interests, sometimes by political, sometimes by ideological interests. But the point is this, disinformation is behind most science denial. I could never figure out who's profiting in any way from flat Earth. Maybe that's the exception. Maybe that's the one that arises organically. But when you look at anti-vax, when you look at anti-GMO, when you look at evolution denial, climate denial, flat or tobacco, they've all, you can tell who's behind it, what the interests are, and in some cases where the money comes from. And it's a very dangerous thing because that success in fighting the science for 60 years led some politicians, I think, to say, wow, if they can do that about science, we can do this about anything at all. And we all know
even
who I'm
election
talking about.
outcome, yeah.
Even the election outcome in 2020. And so that is a denialist campaign. It follows the 5 steps: cherry picking evidence, conspiracy theory, illogical reasoning, reliance on fake experts, and belief that the other side has to be perfect. It is a denialist campaign. And unfortunately, it led to violence. But I think that there is a straight road between the strategy that was invented by those tobacco executives in 1953 and what we saw in the storming of the Capitol in 2021.
Would you also recognize that strategy as one that you can identify with what philosopher Harry Frankfurt calls bullshitting?
I love Harry Frankfurt.
Okay,
yeah.
so here's Harry Frankfurt is a philosopher, and he wrote this wonderful article, actually entitled "On Bullshit." And what he says is, there's so many people, companies, businesses, institutions that are not even involved in trying to understand what the truth is. They are merely involved in spreading doubt.
There are many ways to be hostile to truth, and bullshit is one of them. But I don't think that's what's going on now with Stop the Steal or with science denial. As I recall, so his essay was turned into a short book, and I mean, he's a lot of people have read it. And as I recall, his argument was that a bullshitter is somebody who doesn't care about the truth.
Yeah.
A bullshitter is somebody who just, if there are traffic cones out, they will just, walk however they want to walk, not through them, not around them, but just, whatever their path is going to be. That's not quite what's going on these days. If you look at what's happening with Stop the Steal in the United States, that's strategic denial. You can't say that they don't care. They do care very much. It's just, it's a different kind of lying. I wrote another book earlier called Post-Truth, right, in which I define that notion as the political subordination of reality. That's when you care very, very much about what people believe. And the goal is not just to convince them that a false thing is true, but to so dominate their reality that they give up, that they become cynical of even knowing the truth. And so they turn to an authoritarian leader. That is the ultimate danger, I think, of allowing this to go too far. Maybe it started with the crop circles and it ended up with science denial, and now it's ending up with political extremism that may very well cost the United States its democracy.
Right. So So that brings us perhaps to the last topic that we want to discuss with you, and that is that it's, many people now think that we're at some kind of tipping point, right? Forces gathering against science seem pretty powerful. Is that really the case? The situation seems, confusing. On the one hand, society's trust in science is higher than ever. A recent survey in the Netherlands by the so-called Rathenau Institute shows that 74% have confidence in science. At the same time, on the other hand, nearly 20% of Americans believe QAnon to be somewhat or very accurate. What's going on? There's no reason to think that the numbers in the Netherlands will be all that different. There are people in the Netherlands thinking weird beliefs or holding weird beliefs. Are we at a tipping point? Should we strengthen science a lot more? And how are we going to cope with this?
It is, you've asked the ultimate question, right? Because the human brain is the same the world over. The United States has been particularly targeted with this information on these topics. But it is, this is a worldwide problem. And you're right, most people do trust science. But here's the question I always ask. They may trust science, but do they understand it? Do they understand how science works? Do they understand that it's not about proof and certainty, so that when a scientist changes their mind about, say, whether masks work, they don't think that they're lying to them and then start to get converted over to being a science skeptic? So I think that part of the answer here is, I think it's talk. I think that we need more scientists to get involved and more people to get involved in talking to science deniers and other people who disagree with us, because that will begin to overcome the trust deficit. I don't think that there are, I don't think many science deniers actually know scientists. But when you read the literature about how hardcore science deniers change their mind, it's a result of close encounters with scientists in a personal way, because they learn that these are warm and trustworthy individuals that, are kind of interesting to talk to. And then all of a sudden, the scientist is not this evil other, this person who's been demonized on the disinformation they've been reading, but somebody who's pretty smart. And, if they take the time to talk to them, they can actually convince them. So I think that that's going to be the way out of the problem. Let me put it this way. It's part of the answer. I think the other part of the answer is to stop the amplification of disinformation. Think of it as a disease. We need to deal with the people who are already sick, who are already infected with QAnon. And some of them we're going to convince to come back, and some of them we're not. Most of them we're probably not. So let's look for the vector of that disease, and it's disinformation. And it's Facebook, it's Twitter, it's YouTube that are irresponsibly sharing disinformation. Center for Countering Digital Hate found that 65% of the propaganda on anti-vax was due to 12 people. We've got to put a stop to that.
Right. Yeah, I can only, yeah.
Yes,
maybe,
I think you have to Dutch vote.
Yeah. So, 12 points from the Netherlands go to Lee. So maybe we should take some time to see whether there are any questions from the audience. We have a live audience here in the Congress building, and we also have a chat for those people who follow us through a live stream. Maybe there's anyone who'd like to, if that's okay with you, Lee.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
This is my favorite part.
Okay, let's do that then. There's a question over there from the conference site itself. There's a microphone.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you very much. I was curious on what do you think, like, if we don't act on these points, like, what's the doom scenario? I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on that. How bad could it get?
Pretty bad. We're in some ways in a new era because of the internet. But propaganda is not new. Propaganda needs a mechanism to spread, and it has, been effective in the past in, various ways in various regimes. I think the doom scenario is the George Orwell scenario. Hannah Arendt talked about this, to make it real world and not science fiction. Hannah Arendt, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, talked about what happens in a society in which people are so inundated with falsehood that they begin to doubt that they can even know the truth. So the doom scenario is that is what the authoritarian wants. The Holocaust historian, a later Holocaust historian, Timothy Snyder, said it best: post-truth is pre-fascism. So what I worry about as an American, as a human being, is electoral dictatorship. I worry about when people don't know who to trust at all and they stop trying, and whatever the government is saying, we can't really fight it, so let's just go along. And then maybe you've got elections, but they're not real elections, like happens in Russia. That's what worries me.
So 3 minutes ago you were rather optimistic, and now you talk about a doom scenario.
Well, she asked.
Oh, okay.
How bad can it? Look, that's how she asked. How bad can it get? That's how bad it can get.
And what can we do about it?
Is to do something.
Yeah. What can we do?
So what is the most important thing to do?
We can become more politically engaged. We can make sure to always vote and not underestimate the problem, to recognize that we're in an information war and stop calling it misinformation and start calling it disinformation. We can reach out to speak to people who disagree with us. There was a wonderful paper in Nature Human Behavior in 2019 by Cornelia Beach and Philip Schmid, which provided the first empirical evidence to show that even a layperson can be effective in talking science deniers out of their beliefs. It's called technique rebuttal, and it's based on those 5 tropes that I talked about earlier. If you learn those, you can train yourself how to talk to them, and you can be effective. So look, I didn't mean to take all the air out of the room, because if you read Hannah Arendt, realize this: that's what the authoritarian wants. The authoritarian wants you to feel helpless. The authoritarian wants you to think that there's nothing that you can do. But what you can do is to be alert, stay active, and fight back. A book I would recommend heartily is Tim Snyder's book on tyranny. I think those are the stakes. So, I'm talking about science denial, but the real specter is reality denial. Think of QAnon. Think of what would happen if that got worse. Think what would happen if that spread amongst the political class, not only in the United States, but in other countries. That could get pretty bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, in that case, the storm would really be upon us.
Yes.
Is there a question from the chat,
Is there a question from the chat? Otherwise, we go to let's do one from the chat, and then maybe we have still time for one from the conference room. Yeah.
So there's a lot of questions in the chat, but just to dive a little bit deeper into this, some people specifically asked about what's the role of scientific institutions in this battle, so to say, and also specifically, should we focus more on also education already in high schools or even elementary schools when it comes to critical thinking and scientific theories and stuff like that? What is the role of those institutions in this great war for our sanity? That was my paraphrase.
Well, I'm always going to be in favor of more critical thinking and more philosophy, and I think they should teach it in the earlier grades so that children, understand how to reason about things like this. But of course, adults could use some of this too. There's a wonderful book by a friend of mine, Andy Norman, called Mental Immunity, in which he talks about how adults can learn to inoculate themselves against bad ideas, to become stronger, and then go out and talk to other people and help to strengthen them in fighting back. Scientific institutions could do more of this too. I mean, they can't ignore the problem. If the model is, I tried to share facts and it didn't work, so I'm just going to go back to my lab, the problem will overtake us. Now, there are some very important scientific institutions like the National Center for Science Education. There's the Alan Alda Center at Stony Brook, which trains scientists and journalists and others how to communicate with people who are deniers and people who don't understand science. There's another center, I forget what it's the acronym, but it's at University of Cincinnati that talks about public engagement. It's called Center for Public Engagement with Science. So training scientists and the allies of science in how to have these kinds of conversations is really important. It's important to remember this: we outnumber them. The people who believe in science, there are more of us. So why don't we have a voice? Why aren't we more present on Twitter? Why aren't we, having these difficult conversations? Because ignoring the problem isn't going to go away. So I think there is definitely a role for scientific institutions to do more, but there's also room for grassroots level interventions by everyday people.
Right. I think we have time for just one more question from the live audience on site.
Yes, I didn't hear you talk about the position of the news corporations and the connection between news corporations and big money. For example, Murdoch changes just last month the position of his newspapers in Australia about climate change. So you can recommend Hannah Arendt, but I think it starts with the big news corporations like Fox News, and in Holland you have also that kind of stuff. I lost my sense.
To fight them, to make them more fair, more honest.
Yes, there is a connection between Fox News, for example, and big money, and how to correct that.
It is. I mean, you're exactly right, because this is another amplifier. It's not just the internet. People don't just go to YouTube. They turn on Fox News and they hear disinformation, for instance, about the coronavirus and what to. Or now there's a new documentary coming up about January 6th. I mean, what do you do when some of the news sources are really propaganda networks? I think here again, it's maybe go after the advertisers. Maybe, if everyday citizens began to say, if you advertise on these programs that are, sharing scientific and other disinformation, we won't patronize your products. I think if, that could be organized well enough, they might begin to change. Because right now, they're making money. Right now, Facebook is making money on disinformation. When somebody's making money, it's hard to talk them out of it. But, I think you put your finger on exactly the problem here. I remember a paper by, an article by Chris Mooney, the great science writer from the Washington Post, who speculated once that, he was wondering, why is it that the greatest climate change deniers, the countries that have the most climate change deniers, are the United States, Britain, and Australia? I mean, they're 1, 2, and 3. Why is that? And the conclusion he came to is because they all have Rupert Murdoch news sources. So you have put your finger, I think, on exactly what the problem is. It's disinformation, and it's a hard thing, at least in the United States, because there used to be something called the fairness doctrine that we don't have anymore, and it's been a puzzle to figure out how to hold news sources accountable without stepping all over our freedom of the press. But when during a time of COVID, when they're sharing information that could get people killed, that is a danger that I think should raise alarm bells for all of us. And I wish there were more of a campaign against the advertisers. I think that might make some difference. And I'm curious to know now how Murdoch changed his position on climate change in the Australian newspaper, but I will Google that. I'll do my research a second where I have a chance.
Okay, thanks Lee McIntyre. We're running out of time because of our program, but we thank you so much for being here with us and to take
Yes.
time to inform us.
Thank you
very
very
much.
much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And you are of Dutch descent, you told me.
I am, and you know, I've never visited either, and so once COVID is in the rearview mirror, please have me back in person because I would love to be there.
Yes, let's do
You're
that.
always welcome.
Yes.
Hope to see you in the
Thank you.
future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Thank you.